Well, we're at the highlight of our visit to the Rhine Valley, which is Monte Castello, right? Monte Castello is this hill right here in front of us, okay? So, this was the main objective, not only for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, but also for the 4th Army Corps. This whole area that goes from the coast, where we were about 3 days ago, up to Castelnuovo, which is in that direction, that is the area of the 4th Army Corps. Only from east of Castelnuovo does the area of the 2nd Army Corps of the 5th American Army begin. So, in this area here, we have a small commune, a little cluster of houses called Guanella. It's right there. So in Guanella, that was considered the starting point for the attacks on Monte Castello. Looking here at all this bucolic scene right now with a field full of flowers and trees up there, it seems like something easy to do, right? Taking the top of the hill isn't as high as you see there. The problem was with the fire support on that hill. You can see that behind it there are other hills, right? That other hill you see back there behind that group of little houses, look, there's an even higher hill. You see the top of the hill here, right? That one over there is Mount della Torracchia. Behind it, up there were observers as well. Behind it is all the Wehrmacht artillery, right? All the German artillery from this region behind the della Torracchia. And behind that, all of this here, up to the last hill over there, from this mountain range, which is called Monte Belvedere. So what is the general objective here? When the Brazilian Expeditionary Force arrived here at the very beginning of November 44, they already took up positions there in Guanella, right? Replacing the task force, Task Force 45, which had established itself in this area. So the objective is to take this hill here out of the hands of the Germans. Because from the top of that hill over there, you can see, down there, Highway 64 passes through. Right here, look, in this direction, here, above this elevation that we're seeing, here, that's blocking the horizon. So down there, Highway 64 passes through, and the guys up there can see down below if they can see down below. They coordinate the artillery that's all back here to be able to pound the road down there. So the road becomes useless, it gets disabled, it's not safe for transit. So you need to conquer this set of mountains here, which goes from Belvedere up to there to Castelnuovo, which is over there. Once you conquer this part here, the job is, let's say, done. Okay, you push the Germans away from the road, but the mountains are still next to the road after Castelnuovo. Yes, but that's the responsibility of the 2nd Army Corps. We can't take on the whole world. Our responsibility is within our area of operation. If they clear theirs over there, and we don't clear ours here, it won't amount to anything. It won't lead to anything, okay? If we clear ours here, and they don't clear theirs over there, the vehicles can still get through up to there. So, the first attacks here at Monte Castello were carried out by the commander of Task Force 45, Task Force 45 Right, which is Task Force 45 that actually received reinforcements from a Brazilian battalion. You will remember the following, that at this moment the other 2 regiments were still in Pisa, right? At the Tenuta di San Rossore, about to be transferred directly here. So what came from the Serchio Valley to here? The Brazilian Expeditionary Force Detachment came. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force Detachment, about the size of a brigade, right? Approximately, not exactly. But it was the 6th Infantry Regiment from Castello. So there were 3 battalions that came here. So in the first attack, you have a Brazilian battalion, together with the rest of Task Force 45 carrying out an attack on Monte Castello. This first attack, in fact, is successful. It happens in November, still at the beginning of November, and it is successful in taking the top of Monte Castello. This shows what? It shows first that the Germans had not yet established their defensive scheme with greater focus here at Monte Castello, okay? So, it became clear to both sides after this first attack that Monte Castello, even though it is not the highest, is the central objective of this offensive, okay? But the task force, 45, attacked Monte Castello and managed to take the top of Monte Castello. What happened next was the classic German reaction of counterattacking to retake the objective. The Germans are known for this. When a position is taken, they immediately launch a counterattack to retake it. This happened in several places, notably in Normandy, where we'll be going in 60 days. At Pointe du Hoc, for example, they lost Pointe du Hoc and immediately launched a counterattack, followed by 48 hours of counterattacks to try to retake it, right? The Rangers managed to hold on, but that's it. The modus operandi of the German army at the time was to counterattack immediately. So what happened the following night was that they counterattacked, and drove them off the top, so they lost the hilltop. Because the counterattack is preceded by a very powerful artillery barrage that comes from back here against the summit up there, okay? So it was vacated. Then the soldiers went up, and this time they established themselves, setting up bunkers and machine gun nests. All of this became much more complex later on, okay? The next attack was on the second to last day of the month. It was on November 29th. I had mentioned to you that the insistence on taking this here, right, which is the central point, is due to the goal that the person set for themselves. Being in Bologna at Christmas, Mark Clark wanted to be in Bologna at Christmas because that would be good both for his image and for the American people to report, look, we managed to be in Bologna at Christmas, an important date. So, in the absolute lack of infantry units that the 4th Corps had at that moment, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was the only unit capable of carrying out any kind of offensive. So, again, on the 29th, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was ordered to climb Monte Castello, to take Monte Castello. What was the difficulty of the attack on the 29th? The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Sampaio Regiment from the 1st Infantry Regiment were committed. Young men who had left the ship on October 6th, in Naples, had been transferred to Pisa to begin their leave, start joint weapons training, and begin their combat inoculation in a low-intensity area, as was done with the 6th Regiment. But by order of the 5th Army, they were called directly to the front line. So we are talking about a regiment, infantry battalions, made up of soldiers, corporals, sergeants, and officers, without any experience and without any real training in so-called modern warfare, rookie troops with no experience at all, who assaulted this objective here, still with the mistaken belief that by assaulting this objective, you would be able to hold it. You may be able to take the top of the hill, yes, but you can't take the artillery that's behind it. The artillery counterattacks as soon as you lose the top of the hill. So, that day, this operation is unsuccessful. It doesn't advance much on the ground because soon after the Germans counterattack. And as you can see here today, folks, even with vegetation, it's all open. Now imagine back then when there was no vegetation because of the artillery impacts. There was no cover at all. Any movement from this line here can be seen from up there, so it's a complex objective to take. So at this first point, for example, we have the baptism by fire of Captain Souza from Recife, Captain Severino Souza, who is today our last living combat veteran. So Captain Souza had his first contact with the enemy. On that day, he lost a friend. Sergeant Cyber, who died from an artillery impact, and he found Cyber's arm, right? He says he pulled the arm and it came off on its own. So that first day, that first contact with the enemy by the 1st Infantry Regiment was pretty negative, right? As if that wasn't enough, a final effort was attempted on December 12th. This time, the 4th Corps gave command of Operation Pro Mascarenas for the first time, gave command of Operation Pro Mascarenas, and Mascarenas had to carry out this attack once again with inexperienced troops, with a battalion from the 11th from San Juan del Rey and the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Regiment. So in that attack, the situation was even worse because the weather that day was much worse than this, right? It was 100% overcast, but with rain, a light rain since dawn, which prevented any kind of support from the Allied Air Force, right? So there was no air support. And because of this new situation, right, it's a Brazilian attack. Now, the first lack of coordination was observed, right? The first lack of coordination of efforts, because while they were all here, positioned to start the attack, these 3 companies from the 2nd Battalion of the São Paulo Regiment, right next to them, the American artillery opened fire on Mount Belvedere. Which one is Mount Belvedere? Belvedere? Is it that last one? Ah, that last one. Okay. They opened fire on Mount Belvedere, so Mount Belvedere woke up that day to a barrage of American artillery that alerted everyone. Here, then, is the advance of the first ones. The first companies of the 2nd Battalion around here encountered terrible resistance from enemy fire that pinned them down on the ground, just a few meters from the exit, With that light rain, then, the guys couldn't advance much, right? Several platoons, there was also a low fog, so several platoons ended up getting cut off. And one last mistake, right? And this one is already a mistake from the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's own reconnaissance in the previous days, right? Or a big coincidence, an unfortunate one, we can understand it that way too. That group of houses you're seeing there is called Cavitellini, and the reconnaissance patrols that went there on previous nights found that Cavitellini was abandoned by the Germans. But on the morning of the 12th, they were inside, right? With machine guns in those upper windows. Okay, there were spotters, machine guns in the upper windows, and mortars set up in the back part of that group of houses there. Okay. So that position there was mainly responsible for stopping these platoons here. Look, in the intermediate phase of the advance. But then, around 11 o'clock in the morning, a platoon that had been missing managed to make contact, right, using those big wireless radios, right? And this platoon was the Hesch platoon. It was the platoon of First Lieutenant Apollo Hesch. Apollo Miguel Hesch managed to outflank Cavitellini on the left, okay? So he advanced up to that little hill you see behind the house. See that little hill there? He managed to advance up to there. And after getting past that little hill, he was isolated behind that little hill. He found himself facing another German line, another bunker, right? From another defensive position. And that's where his platoon ended up being, well, decimated, right? Almost completely wiped out. And right there, they managed to engage in combat with a small group of German soldiers. They took 4 prisoners there, right? But Hesch had no choice but to get rid of the prisoners. So, the attack is finally called off by General Zenobio da Costa. They're around 3 p.m., right? And it's around 3 p.m. that the news arrives. The order comes for Hesch to retreat. Okay, so at this point, Hesch doesn't have much to do. If he doesn't wait for nightfall to retreat, he can't retreat during the day. So he's going to stay there until night so he can return with about 10 of the 50 men he took, right? So he lost a lot of people that day. There was even fire support that day from some those M10s, right? American tank destroyers, which are essentially Shermans with heavy caliber guns, the Wolverines, right? Made to really hunt tanks. But here in this region, since there really wasn't any presence of enemy armored vehicles, right? It's known that guarding the passage to the right of Monte Castello, there in Abbatia, there were some Stugs. This report was made in September, October, but it's not known if at that time there were still Stugs in that position. So this attack on the 12th then ends once again frustrated. And this attack on the 12th ends the phase of operations, right? The phase of offensives by the 4th Corps for the rest of 1944. It's a realization that Clark's planning really wasn't going to work, right? Right at the beginning of December, Clark moves up to command the 15th Army Group, and the 5th Army is taken over by another general named Lucien Truscott. Until then, he commanded the 6th Army Corps down in southern France, right? Advancing there in southern France, he came back here to take over the 5th Army. So the command changes, okay, and the guidelines change as well. Look, even from here, I can see a truck passing by over there. There's already a road, so the view from up there is even better. You can see a truck passing on the nearby road from here. So at that time, it became clear that Monte Castello couldn't be captured on its own. It wasn't possible. You would have to neutralize the other positions before capturing Monte Castello. So that's why the objective becomes Belvedere. The main objective becomes Belvedere. The initial one, actually, right? It becomes Belvedere. Since October 1944, Clark had requested the transfer of the 10th Mountain Division, which is a division specialized in mountain combat, to Italy. This division was being trained in Colorado, made up only of specialized personnel, mountaineers, skiers, even some Olympic competitors, right? So it was a division called that way because of its personnel, its equipment, and everything it represented. It was an elite division that even had a supply of mules, right? It's perhaps the only division in the United States Army that used mules as part of its organization because these animals are necessary for climbing cliffs, right? To climb very steep mountains with supplies. So they even brought their own mules from the United States. So these people were transferred here at the very end of December 44, arriving at the beginning of January 44, there in Livorno. And then they settled to the left of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, right? The Brazilian Expeditionary Force's occupation zone, the front line held by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. It stretches from Castelnuovo then and goes a bit further here, look, to our left, okay? You often see that position, that photo of the patrol with a little tower on top, which people identify as Torre de Nerone, but it's not. It's called Rocca Corneta. It's in that direction over there. And Rocca Corneta kind of marked the limit of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's area. With the area of the 10th Mountain then, the 10th Mountain sets up over there, and their objective is to take Belvedere, right? But the mountaineers, they arrive here, and their pre-battle analysis indicates that Mount Belvedere has a very exposed face, right? Both their south face and their southwest face are very exposed to observation from another mountain, another section of the range here, which is known as Monte della Riva. Monte della Riva is known by the Americans as River Ridge. So you'll often find this reference to River Ridge. You'll see a lot of references to the conquest of River Ridge. It's still the main story, right? In the memory of the 10th Mountain Division. So River Ridge is even farther over there because between Belvedere and River Ridge, there's a kind of valley. So over there, it was initially taken on the night of, if I remember correctly, February 18th to 19th. The Americans climbed River Ridge to be able to silence the observation and artillery from River Ridge the following night. So from the 19th to the 20th, they climbed Mount Belvedere. Okay? While the capture of River Ridge was largely successful with few casualties, the climb up Belvedere had more problems. And from up here on Belvedere, they went along the ridges here. Look, Belvedere, Gorgolesco, Della Tarracchia. These guys suffered a monstrous amount of losses, you know? There were about 700, more than the fever, more than the fever, more than the fever. So they really suffered a pretty intense amount of losses, right? They had a little over 1,000 deaths throughout the whole campaign, and just here there were 700 in this action. Just here there were 700 men, okay? So once Belvedere had been taken, on the 20th, on the 21st here, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force then receives the mission to conquer Monte Castello, since the artillery is no longer available to defend Monte Castello. So the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's own artillery, firing from down below, will continuously bombard the top of the hill here, allowing the soldiers to advance, right? And Captain Souza, once again, he took part in the attack on February 21st, right? He even says, wow, it was much easier. So the climb up Monte Castello. He even remembers that at a certain point, the Brazilian artillery might not have realized that they were already so far ahead in the climb. And they had to look for shelter, a kind of cave that's halfway up, right? Until the artillery stopped firing, right? So they could finish the climb, right? So around 5 in the afternoon, the Brazilians actually conquer the summit of Monte Castello for good, right? While the North Americans, the guys from the 10th Mountain Division, they were still here, halfway up. Unable to conquer Della Tarracchia. Della Tarracchia was held by the Germans, right? So that represented a reversal of orders in the planning, because Della Tarracchia was supposed to be taken before Monte Castello, right? Because if Della Tarracchia was taken, Monte Castello would be essentially defenseless. But in this case, Monte Castello fell before Della Tarracchia. Okay, so on the night of the 21st, this area was under Brazilian and American control, but the one behind, over there, was still German, okay? So on the 22nd, seeing that the situation wasn't changing, the Germans wouldn't leave Della Tarracchia. Willis Krittenberger then ordered the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to capture 2 positions that are right here. Look, 2 positions that are right here to the right of Monte Castello. These 2 positions are the elevation, if I remember correctly, 958, right? And another position called La Serra. Okay, so these 2 positions are behind over there. And capturing them would leave the rear of the German position there at Della Tarracchia unprotected, right? Vulnerable. So with that, if they conquered that part, they expected the Germans would give up Della Tarracchia. Finally, it was causing a large number of casualties for the mountain troops. So from Monte Castello, then going around the mountain on this side here, they went around the mountain. These 3 Brazilian platoons, in fact, there was another target, a third target, called Bela Vista, right? But Bela Vista was a little over here, and it didn't suffer any counterattacks. Only 958 and La Serra mainly suffered counterattacks. There, in Bela Vista, was the only recorded death of an expeditionary due to a bayonet wound. Okay, so The Germans stabbed the Brazilian soldier here in the chest, right? Here in the chest, in the abdomen, and the guy ended up dying there, see? He was about to do a reconnaissance of a house, and the soldier was inside. So it's for us to understand how, on that particular night, the combat became much closer than what was usually observed here, right? So back there, we'll go there, La Serra as well, later on, explaining it more briefly here. The Jewish lieutenant named Moises Raun took the 958 and further ahead Lieutenant Apollo Hesch. Again, right? He took La Serra. This was close to midnight from the 22nd to the 23rd. So there, the two platoons settled in, but since the Germans are Germans, shortly after, they decided to counterattack the positions. And then the number of Germans involved was really large, and their fire support was also tremendous because the artillery was already further back, right? So there was a very heavy concentration of fire that night, both from the German artillery and the Brazilian artillery, trying to hit the starting points of the German counterattacks. That's when Apollo was wounded in the arm. I'm not sure if it was the left or the right, but one of his arms, probably the left because he must have shot with his right, and he kept firing. He kept shooting. So he stayed there for the rest of the night, holding his position, right? There was a lot of grenade exchange, you know? The Germans would throw grenades and our guys would throw them back to the other side. That was how close they were to each other, right? Just about the distance of a grenade throw. So, there were also prisoners captured. About 7 or 8 prisoners were taken by Hesch. They were able to bring them back. So Hesch stayed there until the next day, while reinforcements were sent over. When they arrived, they reinforced the position. And that night, seeing that both rear positions had been captured and the Germans had lost the top of Della Tarracchia, they gave up the top of Della Tarracchia. In fact, during this attack, the Americans launched those flares to illuminate the top of the hill. So there are many accounts from Brazilian Expeditionary Force soldiers saying that it turned into a mini day up there, right? With so much light on top of Della Tarracchia back there, shining down here. So, yeah. The people from the Brazilian Expeditionary Force above Monte Castello, including Captain Souza, who was there, they reported having a front row view of what would be the taking of Della Tarracchia, that they could see the people from the 10th going up and the Germans defending themselves, and then the Germans coming down from the top and them taking the top of the hill. So this action here, it completes the taking of the mountain range here, right? With the capture of Castelnuovo only happening in the following days. A front of bad weather comes in, a very unexpected and sudden rain starts, which freezes operations for a few days. After that, that's when the capture of this other group here will happen, right? Until then, it's Brazil's responsibility. So the Tower of Nerone will be taken here, so Prochacho as well. And finally, on March 6th, it will be taken. The Nuovo Castle, which is not the same Nuovo Castle we were at the day before yesterday, okay? Nuovo Castle is here, see? So, that's it. Done. Capturing Nuovo Castle secures this mountain range and finally pushes the Germans away from the road, leaving them without a view of it. Then you can go up, at least up to the area of the 2nd Corps. You can go up. And there were a lot of rifles left there, I guarantee it. Okay, because there were 700 dead, right? So there were a lot of rifles left, I guarantee it. And it was exactly on the 24th right, the 24th, that these rifles were left scattered around the area. They were acquired there. They were acquired. They were acquired by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force very well. So that was an explanation here for our people. If you want to come here for the next one, to be able to have this level of instruction, just click on the links below and contact one of our agents, okay? A big hug from the War Room.